Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Pecker from 1998. And this continues my series where I review all of the films directed by John Waters. Pecker is John Waters' art world satire critique on fame, but it's also probably one of his earnest films and sweetest movies. And that might sound surprising because, it's called Pecker, but this film has a really earnest perspective, especially towards its protagonist and his family, and really shows how kind of sweet John Waters could be in some of his movies. There's this kind of connotation between him being a gross filmmaker or having all these gross out moments, but he always was very sweet to his main characters, and Pecker is probably one of the best examples of that. But also this came right at a time when gross out comedy was pretty much starting in terms of having a huge wave in popular cinema. There's Something About Mary had literally probably a couple weeks before been #1 at the box office, having kind of a steady climb throughout the summer until it eventually was #1 over that Labor Day. And this came out at the end of September. So there's actually a lot of pieces saying like maybe John Waters can break out just like There's Something About Mary did. And it certainly helped the reputation of this movie and how it got played on TV so much because people were so into gross out comedies in the ensuing years. So it kind of, in a way, this film came out at the perfect time for it. But there's also more to it than that. It's not just a simple gross out comedy. There's more ideas to it than that. The whole critique of the art world, what it's saying about fame, how it's more of a sweeter, nicer movie than a lot of those gross out films are. Those are meaner. When you think of John Waters, really always the film is on the side of the protagonist. It never feels like he's a mean director who's torturing his protagonist, even if there's a lot of bad things that happen to them, except with Divine. I feel like Divine got tortured a little bit, or like in Polyester definitely, but it still like feels like the film's on their side even in those cases. And I think Pecker was kind of a natural evolution in terms of just being nice to his protagonist, but it also felt like he was returning to kind of the indie film world in a little bit of way. Now certainly in terms of how you classify an independent film, most of the time it's how it was financed, and this film was financed by a major studio. It was financed by Fine Line, which was New Line's kind of art house, more independent focused subsidiary. So he was back at New Line, and it was funded by a studio, but it was half the budget of his previous two films, Crybaby and Serial Mom, which were both at about 12 to 13 million. This was at about 6 million. They certainly didn't have as much time. It feels a little more rougher, but that definitely works a lot better for it. But he got to experience the indie world that he really hadn't been a part of, especially the big 90s indie boom. He was making studio pictures while Pulp Fiction and Sundance and Spike Lee and all that stuff happened. He was still there certainly, but he wasn't making a film that was as much of an independent film as those films were. Now this certainly broke out from that, but it felt like working with someone like Christina Ricci, who is definitely more of an indie darling queen at the time, Edward Furlong, Brendan Sexton III, Lily Taylor. He was really kind of appealing more to the indie vibe, and it kind of feels a little more natural of an evolution than certainly Serial Mom did. And I think that's one of the reasons I've always kind of had a fondness for Pecker. It's certainly not my favorite John Waters movie, and it's not even my favorite in the later period, but there's something about it that I always liked, and maybe it is that earnestness, that almost classic Hollywood earnestness that goes throughout it, but also how it can be cynical and critical of the art world and have a comment on celebrity all wrapped up into one, kind of being one of the more layered pictures he's ever done that doesn't actually feel like it's that layered even while it's doing it. It feels like more of an auteur film, more of a genuine Waters film, right when you weren't sure if he was moving away from that or not. It feels authentic, and something that Waters has always done is be extremely authentic, and most of what's going through Pecker and what's important to its plot is how it is so incredibly authentic. A young Baltimore boy who finds a broken down camera in his mom's thrift shop, and his name is Pecker, and he's played by Edward Furlong, and starts taking pictures with it all over town in the Hampton neighborhood of Baltimore. He decides to put on a show at the sub sandwich shop that he's working at and just takes photos around town of his friends and things he sees every day. So he puts on a show and invites all his friends, and then suddenly a New York art dealer comes in, played by Lily Taylor, and decides to buy his photographs and put on a big show in New York of his photos. And then suddenly after the show, he becomes the toast of the New York art scene and a major celebrity. And suddenly when him and his family come back to town, they are well known and famous, and everything starts to fall apart as Pecker can't take photographs the way he used to, and none of his friends and family can do the things the way they used to because they've all become so famous. One way to read this film, and a lot of people brought it up when this this film was released, but Waters shot it down pretty persistently in interviews and in the audio commentary on the DVD. And that theory is that it's trying to say something about what happened to the Dreamlanders after Pink Flamingos and what happened to Waters and his comment on fame. He always disputes that, saying that it took a while for all of them to get notoriety and be famous. None of these characters are really John Waters, and there's not really a divine character in this. Pink Flamingos took a while to become a well-known big hit movie. Nothing about their fame was overnight. I'm paraphrasing what he said, but it's true. Certainly there's certain actors and actresses in John Waters films that have lost their love of doing it and don't really like the fame as much, but I don't think this is necessarily that reading. It's interesting that one of the reasons I was excited about re-seeing Pecker, even though I've seen it countless times, was that I could look at this new theory and re-watch Pecker and imagine that theory. And then I was researching and finding on YouTube lots of interviews from when Pecker was released. It seemed that John Waters just wasn't having it in terms of that theory. I mean, certainly it is semi-close. He did make movies with a bunch of his friends in Baltimore, and they did suddenly become famous and a lot more well-known, specifically in the New York art world. And Andy Warhol did come down to Baltimore and did come to Edith Massey's thrift shop, and he did make Andy Warhol drawings for each of the Dreamlanders, and he was really into that world, and there were a lot of art people who were. So I understand that, knowing what I know about the Waters crew, but a lot of them wanted to be famous. You look at the early shorts, well, I guess you can't, but I saw the early shorts of John Waters, and Divine very much wanted to be in front of the camera. Divine wanted to be famous. And it's interesting that nobody except Pecker is as into it, so I don't buy it. I kind of understand where it's coming from, and it is a little close. But what is interesting is so much of Waters' work has somebody suddenly becoming famous, like Hairspray and Crybaby, or Serial Mom, she becomes famous in that, but you almost always have a press conference. That's in Polyester, it's in Female Trouble, Pink Flamingos. There's like almost always a TV crew asking someone questions. There's a lot of characters who become famous in his movies, but he's never commented on fame except in Pecker, which makes Pecker a unique movie in his filmography. Certainly Cecil B. Demented kind of does, but Pecker is solely about that. What makes this critique on fame more interesting is that he doesn't make Pecker look like an asshole. He makes Pecker be earnest throughout the whole movie. So Edward Furlong, who does a pretty good performance, and a very good earnest performance, he's really kind of the linchpin of this movie. He's kind of a performance you wouldn't actually notice throughout the whole movie, but then if he was gone, you'd suddenly really notice. And Edward Furlong just plays in such a natural way. You really believe him as this earnest photographer who's just trying to capture his Hamden, Baltimore life. With that, you are more sympathetic towards him, and you just see this whirlwind that's going on around them, and you don't like want to just sell them out and sell them down the river and just think he's become a famous asshole or something. And he doesn't really do that, and I think that makes it a little more interesting, showing how authentic he is throughout this film. And even his family, who I kind of love the whole family. Martha Plimpton in this, and Mary Kay Place is the mom, and he has such an interesting cast of characters as the family. I don't think he's ever shown a family as well as in this. Well, I guess Pink Flamingos, but I guess I have a fondness for this movie, and I always like kind of the earnestness of it in terms of like how it could play on Comedy Central, and it played on Comedy Central a lot. As I said before, it came around at like the perfect time for the kind of gross out comedy boom happening. It came out right as it started, so by the time it could be played on TV, that was still contemporary, so it played on Comedy Central a lot here in America, and that's how most people discovered it. In fact, I know a lot of people who don't like really much John Waters, but they own Pecker. And I have a really fond memory of, I was friends with all these kids in middle school, and we were like Waters fanatics, and we knew this film was getting filmed. I was so excited, but then we went to different high schools, and then I went to the Senator Theater, which if you are in Baltimore, you know what the Senator Theater is. It's this gorgeous Art Deco. It was opened in 1939, a beautiful single screen, gorgeous theater. And I remember right after school, I walked to the Senator, which was a long walk actually. And by the time I got there, all my friends were there who were from middle school, who went to the different high school. We all like kind of met up and had like the greatest time. I was so happy. It's like high school sucks, but this is great. It wouldn't get much better. The screening was amazing, and he actually picked out a short that showed like the aerodynamics of building a bra. John Waters would select a short. I remember us all laughing. It's like these 10 or 12, 14-year-old boys just laughing, and this one woman in front of us kept going like, "Shut up, it's not that funny, it's not that funny." And she kept going like, "Shush, shush, you're not taking this seriously." I laughed at the time, and then I remember walking home and kind of being embarrassed, like I shouldn't laugh in a movie, I should know better than that. And then years later, I thought, John Waters put that there as a joke, and the problem wasn't us, it was that lady, and it like took me a while to get over that. I think what I like about this movie is he continues this idea, and it's an idea I keep talking about throughout his filmography, of the outcasts versus the upper class, the establishment. And what's interesting is what he does is the outcast is almost like all of Baltimore, and the establishment is the art world. I think there's a real beauty in that, but it also shows what works about a Waters film, is that when the outcasts are triumphant, but not only are they triumphant, they suddenly show that what they're doing is not bad or evil, and that they're misunderstood. It ends in a party, everyone's dancing, and it's kind of glorious. It's like, why don't you come over to our site and see what it's like? And they make New York, like he says, no to the Whitney, and they all come to Baltimore. It's more of a fun movie. You know, that's the one thing about his Hollywood stuff. The other stuff is weirder and grosser and hard to sit through, and I don't usually watch them with other people. But like Pecker and Crybaby and Serial Mom and Hairspray are like fun. They're joyous. It has such an earnest energy, and that it's being mean about New York City art people, and who doesn't love to hate those people? Pecker is kind of like his own thing, and I think that's why I love John Waters, is his authenticity, how genuine he is. And as much as this is a nicer movie, a sweeter movie, it still feels like John Waters, and that's one of the things I always defend about Hairspray. It's like, as much as you want to say it's him selling out, if you really look at how his filmography works, it's not. And I think Pecker falls into that very well, and that's really what I like about Pecker. I like its kind of indie vibe, even though in all actuality, I guess it wasn't an indie movie. It was a Hollywood movie. It had all the guilds, all the crews and the unions, but they shot it so quickly it has more of an indie vibe to it. I think his movies work a little better look-wise if they're a little rougher and grimier and such. The person I've always thought kind of steals the show in this movie is Christina Ricci. Gives a really great performance. Certainly she was at the peak of her kind of indie queen status at that time. She says a lot of things like, I hate modern photography, and it's like a really funny line, but I don't think most people could pull off the line she does as well as she does. Like, I beg you, Pecker, do not become an asshole. And like things like that, that it's like, it's funny if I say it, but the way Christina Ricci really delivers it, there's no one I really dislike in this film. I think everyone's really good, and it does have a nice classic Hollywood sweetness to it. This is probably the most classic Hollywood he ever got. Definitely the idea of family and having the grandma live in the house, although that feels like very Baltimore. He's very smart at combining a lot of ideas in this film. He even mentions, though, that Pecker's photography would not have created a stir and made a big deal, and it was actually done by a local Baltimore photographer. I don't think anyone would claim it's one of his better of this period or of his filmography as a whole, but I think it's still a pretty good Waters film, and this is the only Waters film you're going to see, although I would maybe not as into that idea, frankly. I still don't mind it because I kind of like what it's doing, and you'll still get the basic idea of Waters and what he's trying to do. You're getting the versus idea, and really the versus of this isn't an actual antagonist, it's the art world itself. There's actually not really a villain in this. The whole idea is fame and losing yourself within that. Waters, the interesting thing about this period is I don't think he ever really sold himself out. He always did it purposefully. He always did it as an artistic decision. Whether I liked it or not, that's a different matter, really. He was still always true to himself. And Pecker, not a film that anyone was asking him to do, because it's kind of a cool indie movie to most people, even though it's not. It has that kind of fun vibe, and it makes fun of the art world, but it also makes you kind of love these characters and love your small town. And if you're a kid growing up in Baltimore, you're definitely going to love that. I'm not much of a nostalgia for nostalgia's sake person in terms of my movie taste. If something I liked as a kid or when I was younger and I reevaluate it, oftentimes I don't like it. But Pecker I kind of like just as much as I did when I was a teenager, laughing with my friends in the Senator Theater. I have kind of a newfound appreciation a little bit because I love how it's the natural evolution of what he was doing, but it's grimier and dirtier. As I was seeing him get more and more Hollywood, he kind of steps back a little bit and does a bit of a smaller movie, but it doesn't feel like a smaller movie. It's everything I like about him, but in a very kind of Hollywood twist way. I love that sweetness to it. I love the earnestness to it. I love how satirical it can be. It's really his return to form. I think Dirty Shame is viewed that way because he goes more towards the gross out thing, but Pecker to me is his real return to form after getting more and more Hollywood. Pecker is definitely one of his better late period films, and I think it's also probably one of his most genuine films that doesn't have to be gross and disgusting. It shows how smart he was with character and the perspectives he'd take, but also making a real joyous film in the end. I love how this movie just feels itself, and I think that's kind of the most wonderful thing about it. And maybe that's the pretentious kind of thing Lily Taylor might have said to him in the sub shop, but that's absolutely why I like this movie. Although I don't think it's his greatest movie, I think it's one of the greatest of his later period, and a definitely bright spot on his filmography. But also I think if you're looking at the context of the time and just kind of a fun indie comedy, it's one of my more favorite ones I can think of. So if you have seen Pecker and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And check out my John Waters review playlist. I've reviewed all of his filmography up until this point, and if you're watching this much later, I have reviewed all of his filmography. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.